Hey, all, here's my AM 950 radio Minnesota Progressive Repartee version of the radio show. Here on the podcast, I recorded it on Friday, the 25th of January, and I talk with a reporter who covers the Minnesota State Legislature about ERA and gun rights, and it's a flashback to the 70s feeling day, as we're still talking about equal rights for women and gun control in this country. Then I talk with astrophysicist Paul Wallace about why things are colliding in the universe. And it's a fabulous conversation. A lot going on in the news today. We did a pre-record. It's also the day when the Roger Stone indictments are coming down. We recorded this before those were announced in their detail. So hope you enjoy the show. I really love Fridays on the AM 950 Progressive Voice of Minnesota Repartee, which is this afternoon radio show. This one's pre-recorded, pretty clean. Hope you enjoy. Have fun. Hey, good afternoon, and welcome to the Repartee. Doug Padgett in today, and I'm recording on Friday morning. Now, I bring that up because I'm going to be talking with Kevin Featherly here in a moment about what's going on over at the legislature, but there's so much news happening over the course of today. News about the shutdown, news about Roger Stone being indicted and having an appearance in a federal court today, and what's going to be released there. So it's quite possible that our recording this morning will feel a bit passé if big news starts to break over the course of the day. But as we like to say around the repartee, this is evergreen kind of news and conversation. So we're super glad that you're along with us today. And I am in Arizona, and I'm only saying that because, you know, I feel part of the Twin Cities community all the time, even when I'm traveling like today. And I feel for that 1 below temperature that it is right now when I'm doing this recording. So for those of you that are suffering through 1 below, know that that there is hope on the horizon. Someday, in days shortly ahead, it's going to be wonderful there, like it is here in Arizona, honestly. And so I'm not bragging. I'm sort of confessing that I am not in weather cold solidarity with all of my loved ones and friends there and the others who are part of the repartee. But glad to have Kevin along. Hey, Kevin, thanks for being back. This is Kevin Featherly from Minnesota Lawyer, and he pays attention and writes about what's going on over at the Capitol. So good to have you in again.
Thanks a lot.
Hey, Kevin, it's interesting. As we were talking about what's happening at the Capitol, I was pleased and a little bit surprised to see that one of the topics that they're taking up at the Capitol is around the Equal Rights Amendment, an ERA bill. And
what's old is new again.
Man, what is going on with that? I mean, the most framing conversations of my childhood was civil rights and equal rights. The ERA amendment from the 1970s is burned into my brain as a young child. I guess it would be like people who were thinking about Trump and the Trump wall if they're 6 years old right now, that they're going to have that be an indelible mark on their sense of what politicians do. And the idea that in the state of Minnesota that you're in a conversation with legislators in 2019 about this amendment and a resolution that Congress has is simply amazing. Update us on what's going on over at the Capitol with this.
Well, yesterday at a hearing of the State Government Operations Committee, which is a policy-only committee, so no finance bills passed through there, 2 bills went through. One was Mary Kanish-Padin's bill to institute in Minnesota a constitutional amendment in the Minnesota Constitution, essentially replicating the 1970s vintage Equal Rights Amendment, the idea being that, you know, they want to put gender discrimination on the same footing as racial and religious equality and embed that in the state constitution. The other bill was a slightly more minor affair, but involves the larger subject of the federal ERA, because Rena Moran, who's a representative from St. Paul, Democrat, both of these are Democrats, she has a resolution which effectively communicates to Congress, hey, look, wake this thing up again. Let's have this ERA thing. And the reason that it's sort of shut down is because back in 1979 there was a deadline that passed. They had a 5-year window to pass the ERA. It didn't pass. 35 of the required 38 states passed the ERA, so they were only 3 states short. Congress then extended that deadline to 1982,
right?
But that was challenged in court, and so whether or not that was a legitimate thing to do was a legally open question. But it kind of didn't matter at the time, because after 1979, no further states adopted the ERA, so no states adopted it in that 3-year window when it was extended. However, 4 states, as I recall, dropped out. So there were 4 states that had ratified the ERA in the 1970s that then their legislatures turned around and unratified it. So it's just kind of a crazy quilt right now. One of the other things that has happened in the intervening years is in 2017 and 2018, 2 further states ratified the ERA, kind of out of the clear blue sky. But that's in the wake of the Me Too movement. So that sort of, I think, is one of the things that woke this thing up again. And so to get back to Moran's resolution, she's trying to get that deadline taken out so that, as they see it, the remaining 1 state that needs to ratify it can do so. The issue, though, is it 1 state or is it 6 states that need to ratify it?
Unbelievable. So for those of us who don't follow the workings between a state legislature and its ability to put pressure on Congress around something like this, how does that work? Why does Representative Moran or others in the legislature think that something Minnesota does could affect Congress's attitude toward the timing? How does that work?
I think in the normal sense it doesn't. However, I think because the legislature is a little bit loath to pass these resolutions. It's not that usual that you see these. However, this is the Me Too era, right. And if you take the optimistic view that you're only 1 state short, then why not communicate to Congress that we're in favor of you reopening this thing? And it's not impossible, because all it really takes is to get the attention of 1 member of Congress, right? And then that member of Congress opens a bill and gets or does a resolution. I think it would require a resolution in Congress as well. And that was attempted at one point in 2014. There was a resolution attempting to do exactly this, but it didn't really go anywhere in that Congress. It's kind of a why not?
Why not? Well, it does feel a bit that way, and to me, it's a why in the world not? I mean, is there anyone that you're hearing from in the Minnesota legislature that is contesting the idea that it should be ratified in the Minnesota state constitution? Is there any resistance to having, to matching the language of the federal ERA in language in our constitution?
And the short answer is yes. There was opposition yesterday, particularly to the Minnesota constitutional amendment, the Knish-Podine bill. Came from MCCL, the anti-abortion folks, and that point of view was also expressed by Nick Zerwas, who is a Republican legislator from Elk River, pretty influential member. They're afraid that if this is ratified, it would be used as a tool for future litigation to expand abortion rights. And so Zerwas tried to get some language inserted as an amendment to the bill yesterday that would sort of take that out of the realm of possibility, but that amendment was not accepted and didn't go forward. So that's pretty clear then that you're going to have some Republican opposition. And you're seeing that too. There's a practical effect of that. These bills always have companions, or they have to in order to pass. And both of these do have companions. In the Senate, the constitutional amendment companion bill was offered by Dick Cohen, Democratic senator, and it had 2 Republican sponsors. But they have backed away. And as I understand it, it's because of this fear that this would be used to expand abortion rights. And
I have not followed the pushback on the ERA, in my later years, looking back at the opposition in the 70s, it just felt to me like it was men saying that women weren't equal. I mean, that's what the argument basically felt like. Was the argument
True,
even back in the 70s?
Or
what was it really around abortion rights even back in the 70s? Was that the same rationale that's being trotted out today?
Possibly. I'm sorry to interrupt a moment ago.
That's okay.
I was going to tell you that I think that to some degree it was women, and I based that anecdotally on my own mom. Rest her soul. If you're listening, Mom, I'm about to say something that you have sworn to me is not true, but I was there. It was true. My mom was opposed to the ERA, which stunned me. And I didn't understand why. I asked her why. I was 14 at that point, and she said something I always found peculiar but never forgot. She said, "This is just women trying to take over." So
yeah.
So I think I think it was a generational thing as well. I think that what you're talking about is true, but I think that it was to some degree, probably some limited degree. I'm sure my mom was something of an outlier on that because she was pretty, progressive on much of everything else. I think it was just a generational fear of sort of monumental change and the role, gender roles and all that kind of thing. I think there was something to that too.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I'm reminded by my friends who pay a lot of attention to the influences of patriarchy across our society that all genders and all ages are affected by the power of patriarchy, and its allure tends to sift not just on gender basis, but it just gets into our blood, it gets into our society, it starts to influence the way people think about it. And it's amazing. I do a lot of work trying to help religiously minded people see progressive politics and to embrace progressive politics as their religious convictions. And it's amazing that abortion comes up regularly and consistently in almost every conversation. It's amazing. I can see how it's perhaps more deeply tied to the ERA amendment because you're talking about a constitutional amendment saying that a woman's rights can't be denied as a woman. I could see that linkage. But the issue of abortion in this country, while being legally settled, continues to raise its head and to have deep influence all across the system, and here it is again. We're talking with Kevin Featherly. He covers the state legislature and the machinations and the storylines and the backstory that go on there. We're going to be back with him here in a minute because there's a number of things going on around gun legislation as well. And so, Kevin, when we come back, I want to talk about, having talked about the ERA, we'll talk about gun laws in what feels like a retro throwback to the 1970s here on Minnesota's progressive repartee in the afternoons at Minnesota's Progressive Voice, AM 950. Hey, welcome back, AM 950 listeners. Doug Padgett coming to you from Phoenix, Arizona today, but we're talking about all the good things happening over at the Minnesota State Legislature with Kevin Featherly. He covers the important happenings at the legislature. And Kevin, you not only cover it, but you have to write about it. And so you're able to sit in some meetings and have to sit in those meetings and listen carefully to the arguments being made by legislators and their staff often before the rest of us hear about any kind of a proposed legislation. And so you really have
the goal, yes.
A really unique perspective on how the legislation that we ultimately see and ultimately hold our elected officials accountable for, how that comes into being. And there's something going on around guns, which was a big campaign issue for a number of people, especially Democratic legislators in and around the Twin Cities area, the urban spaces. They were really talking about the issues of guns. What's happening on the gun front here at the end of January?
Well, what moved forward yesterday was two bills from Senator Ron Latz that are mirrors of bills that have already been introduced in the House. I think there's some technical differences on the background check one, but I'm not sure that I could speak intelligently to what those differences are. The similarities are much more important. And so one of them is a background check that would require, basically a background check on virtually all purchases of firearms. And this is, interestingly, there's some and the other one, by the way, is a red flag bill, which is on emergency restraining orders and which can result in seizures of weapons for somebody who's in danger of committing violence. On the background check, there's actually Democratic opposition as well as Republican opposition coming from Majority Leader Tom Bach, who said at this, they call it a pre-session briefing. It actually happened after session started, but in that pre-session briefing where the 4 legislative caucus leaders and the governor all appeared, Bach said that he's all for, this gun legislation, but he draws the line when you try to make it so that I can't sell, I'm speaking, in his voice.
Yes, yeah.
I can't sell a firearm to my neighbor who I've known for 40 years.
I see.
If you're going to tell me I have to go to the trouble of getting a background check and all this kind of stuff and go through all of this problem, when I've known this guy for 40 years and I know intuitively that I can trust him right down the line, I draw the line there. Well, as Lats pointed out yesterday, it would be virtually impossible to write a bill like that. He also pointed another good point,
the law that says if you know your neighbor and it's been 40 years and you like the guy, then you can sell him a gun. Yeah, that's not legislation.
That was one of Lats's 2 points. That how would you define neighbor? How would you define bill? How would you define friend in the legislation? But beyond that, how could you create a background check that has this sort of amorphous exemption that you really don't even know who you're talking about? It just wouldn't work. He pointed out that you don't always know your neighbors as well as you think. And going back to another anecdotal incident, I grew up next to a guy who, when I was 10 years old, my twin brother and my older sister, we'd go over to his house. He had this very motherly wife and young child, and we played the board game Password with him almost every day for about a year and a half until he was arrested in 1975 for murdering a jogger and strangling her with her own brassiere.
My goodness.
You truly never know your own neighbor.
Yeah, boy, Kevin. That's a great anecdote because that's what you hear most times when someone is caught for a heinous crime. The neighbors and sometimes even family members say, "Wow, who would have thought? Who would have known?" I'll tell you, I think I'm about as anti-gun as you can get. If I could become more anti-gun, I would. If there was a pill to take or a position to hold, I would do it. But So I am not at all defending the guns. It feels to me like somebody who wants to see a change in our gun culture and see guns become something that is viewed the way that smoking is viewed as a public threat and as a hazard to our public life and to personal health. These bills that Democrats keep pushing for, background checks, all that's going to do is keep it out of the hands of a person who's already been convicted of certain crimes, where many people who commit violence with a gun, whether it's violence to themselves and suicides or domestic violence or stranger attacks, this is the first time they've ever had a run-in with the police. So it's not going to accomplish any of that. And the idea that somehow we're going to have a mental health narrative that's going to be invoked just seems, if it truly is, as people argue, and I do not think it is, I want to be clear about this, but if it is, as people suggest, a constitutional right to bear an arm, to have a weapon, if it's your constitutional right, we are in real jeopardy if we start saying that you can remove someone's constitutional rights because of the diagnosis of their psychiatrist. Which other rights that are constitutional rights embedded in the Constitution in this country would we then start taking from people if they were deemed to be someone who their psychiatrist said poses some kind of a threat? So we have to get to the root issue of all of this, and I know there's some DFL legislators that are trying to do it. In your conversation, are there conversations you're hearing around the Capitol? Are there any people expressing their resistance to these bills not going far enough, or is all the resistance, sort of the point that I'm making, or is all the resistance only coming from those who think that it's going too far?
The answer to that is no. But I'm speaking to legislators in the main. I would suspect if I were to circulate among the people, gathered in the rotunda, I might get some of that kind of feedback. But no, I think, like Governor Wallace says, their approach is, we don't buy the idea that nothing can be done. And that's a lot of the pushback that you get from gun opponents. At least last year, what I heard was that, these won't cure everything, therefore there's no point in doing anything. And that's a radical sort of balderization of what they're actually saying, but it gets to the point. Yeah. I'd like to, if you don't mind, I'd like to turn back to some other action that's going on in there.
Sure, please.
There's another bill, talking about bills. Eric Lucero has a bill. He's a GOP representative that wants sort of driving another narrative around guns. That kind of gets to your point, which I'm going to have to remain mute on if you don't
Feel
mind.
free. Yeah, no, it's even better. For people who don't know that you as a reporter should not be expressing your opinion, which lets me just run roughshod of my opinion without commentary. I love it.
Please feel free. It means I have to do less thinking.
Yeah.
But anyway, Eric Lucero has a bill that will permit and train school staff to carry firearms.
Unbelievable.
So, that's another narrative. There's also another bill from Jeff Hayden that would be in honor of his sister Taylor, who was murdered in Atlanta in 2016 in a crossfire. She just happened to bumble onto this scene where a crime was occurring, and she was murdered. She had nothing to do with it. Very promising young woman, as I understand. And that would basically issue some public health grants. And the way he phrases it is it would train people on the consequences of the misuse of firearms. So I can only imagine that would, be something akin to the sort of movies we used.
Yeah. The drunk driving movies.
The horrible car crash movies we used to watch. Yeah, when we were training to learn how to drive. So that's pretty much a more holistic picture of what's going on so far.
Yeah. Well, that's Kevin Featherly. Kevin, thank you so much for all your good work and for giving us your Friday roundups and tap-ins. We'd always love more time with you, and we'll find time to do that. So thanks, Kevin. We appreciate it. Hey, you listen to AM 950, the Progressive Voice of Minnesota. This is the Repartee. We'll be back after the break. Hey, welcome back all to the Repartee. Doug Padgett in, and it's Friday, so that means we get to talk with our astrophysicist, Paul Wallace. And as I mentioned, this is a pre-recording that we're doing here on Friday morning. It's 10:05 Central Time. And so we know that indictments came down about Roger Stone, and they've got him stone cold. We're going to be talking about our own stones today with the astrophysicist, rocks hitting rocks. Because three of our stories have to do with that. But it could feel like these, there's some big news stories that are out in front of us that we want to pay attention to on the Repartee, of course, that we might not have a chance to talk to because of the pre-record. That could be the shutdown. There might be some movement happening there. And, of course, indictments coming down, which to people like me who want to see the rule of law be put in place. I feel, astrophysicist Paul Wallace, I feel a bit like my conservative friends that are arguing for putting a bunch of stones up and concrete up around the border to keep people out, all under the basis of law and order. I'm like, why don't we start our law and order push
Right.
with the president and the current sitting set of indictments rather than the fictional invasion that's happening?
Not that kind of law and order.
Right, unbelievable.
Right,
hey, so speaking of great collisions, speaking of things crashing into one another, we were setting up the show here, and you had this great sense of a theme that three big news stories. That one of them being that I'm just going to list them off here, and then we can chat about them. That a meteor hit the moon during the lunar eclipse. That was such a big deal on Monday, on Sunday night. Yeah. And then the second is the headline in the news was, "We're finally figuring out how Uranus ended up on its side," which sounds like a Sunday morning joke about someone that says we finally figured out how Uranus ended up knocked down on your side. Every time I talk about the planet Uranus, I get a 12-year-old joke running through my mind. And then the third being that apparently Earth's oldest rock was found by astronauts on the moon, and that one I feel like we need to save our whole final segment to talk about that bit of craziness. How it is that the oldest rock known to Earth was on the moon, and astronauts happened to find it and bring it back when they were there, back in the 70s. So, a real theme to our space talk today.
Yeah, that's right. The thing you need to keep in mind, sort of in the background through the entirety of today's segment, is that the solar system used to be a much more violent place than it is now. The planets were built up of smaller rocks, and over time, rocks sort of got pulled towards other rocks gravitationally, and over time built up into larger planets. So in the past, it was a much more violent place than it is now, but there's still a few rocks left over, so there's still some collision. So that's kind of the picture to keep in your mind, is that the solar system used to be billions of rocks, and then they slowly got built up into planets, and that was a very violent process. So...
All right, so that's helping me a little bit. I feel like I'm back in the 1970s with the whole segment of this show. As I mentioned to you, that when we were off air here, that we talked about the Equal Rights Amendment. We talked about gun control, which were big things in the 70s. We're talking about the moon and rocks. And now, to hear you explain this, you're saying that the way planets and moons and, I don't know, I guess all the other big things that we see in the universe, those are rocks coming together, forming.
I thought they were formed that way. Yes,
because this has been the big question for a lot of people. You know, I come from religious traditions that have had arguments about how all things got here, and they. One of the explanations is, I don't know, God just makes all the stuff and then it's there in full form. And then
kind of like magic. And then, our science has let us see the truth of this, that the evolutionary process, and as it's happening in space, is that things are developing over time. But I got to tell you, as someone who totally buys, full evolution, full stop, no contradictions here. It's a little confusing to know how the crust of the earth keeps getting thicker. Right, in the sense that we know that we dig down deeper and find, you go down 50 feet or 100 feet and you're finding things that were civilizations previous. So it's building on itself and getting, at least in some places, wider. And then to hear you say that the planet Earth and other places were rocks flying into rocks and then joining together and melding into one another.
Right.
Help me out here.
I think what distinguishes those two is time. Because the big violent rock building up process occurred in the first billion or so years of the Earth's existence. And then it cooled. Okay, it cooled, and it cools most quickly on the surface. Imagine getting a potato out of the oven, a baked potato. The surface of the potato might be warm, but if you stick your finger in the potato, it's going to be super hot in the middle.
Yeah.
Burn yourself. So the planets, when they cool most quickly on the surface, and so they cool and become rigid and crusty.
So is the center of the Earth going through this cooling process as well? Then
the center of the Earth is about as hot as the surface of the sun.
Wow. Is it cooling? Yeah. Do they think is that the?
It's cooling slowly. Yes, it's cooling slowly, but it takes a long time. Mm-hmm. I mean, super long time.
What was making a billion years ago, 5 billion years ago, everything so hot? Was that all the energy that came out of whatever was referred to as the Big Bang, as sort of the initiation of?
No, that was just the. If you think of the Earth, for example. Being built up. I mean, if you think of large, enormous rocks colliding, that produces heat, friction, basically. Oh. You can think of it that way. And,
so the heat.
Friction.
Go ahead.
There's two things. There's the heat just from the friction and so forth, but there's also radioactivity in the Earth's core that produces a lot of energy.
Okay. So when this melding thing was happening, when the Earth was sort of coming together, that was happening because there was so much energy from the collisions.
Yes.
Because there were more rocks at the time rolling around in our part of the universe?
Yeah, the collisions, just think meteorite impacts. Think of the Earth being hit, once a year with a meteorite. A mile across, over and over and over and over again.
Oh, I see. Yeah, right. Just getting pummeled and
pummeled, and then much more regularly than that. Daily by smaller rocks, and every second by even smaller ones. So it was just this constant barrage, just raining down of asteroids, basically.
What caused that to stop?
we cleaned out the solar system. We vacuumed it all out. The planet's got to be large. And see, the thing is once a particularly large lump begins to form, its gravity increases, and so it becomes a more powerful attractor of other smaller rocks.
Oh, isn't that a great sense of, like, if you take all this talk about, rocks and billions of years ago and physics and astrophysics and say, what are the things we can learn in our social life, that it's almost as if these things, the coalescing of rocks coming together creates something larger, which then has more of the same energy that first brought those rocks together.
Right.
It's almost
a snowball.
It's almost a snowball, a movement of attraction of things being pulled in. Hey, that's
and over billions of years, we've cleaned out most of the little pieces, but those little pieces are still, we still see. You ever seen a shooting star?
Sure.
That's just a little piece of rock flying through the atmosphere and burning up.
So if you could jump in a film time capsule a billion years ago, it would have just been stars, shooting stars galore.
They would have been more common, maybe not constant, but 3-4 billion years ago, yes, it would have been just relentless, never ending.
So one of these meteors hit the moon during the lunar eclipse.
That's right. One of these rocks hit and that's amazing. We've seen meteors asteroids hit the moon before, but never during an eclipse.
Wow.
And
what did that do? What was it about the eclipse that was better for us?
It just darkened the surface of the moon so much that we could see the flash of light of the impact.
Holy moly. So people saw that, huh?
Yeah. Objects hit the moon all the time. But, for example, if the moon is full, you can't really see it because the moon's so bright, you can't see the flash of light against the bright moon. But if the moon is dark, then you can see the flash of light.
And other than that being just wonderfully happenstantial, is there anything I don't know, astrological about it that's meaningful? Is there something?
Yeah, there's the question basically is that it relates to is how regularly is the Earth struck by objects of this size? That thing they figured was about probably 10 kilograms, about 6 pounds or so. The thing that hit the about 20 pounds. And the question basically is at what rate is the Earth being bombarded by these things? And so if we can look at the moon should be getting hit about as often as the Earth. So it's basically a question of what's the current rate of bombardment. And
we don't experience that as much because these meteors hit our atmosphere and break up?
Yeah, they break up. They don't make it. On the moon, they hit the surface because there's no atmosphere.
Yeah.
So they break up before they hit the Earth. Mostly, though, it was just a really cool thing to see.
That's awesome. All right, so we only have a minute or so here to talk about what's happened with Uranus. This is my proctologist joke again. I just can't get over it.
Yeah, and you can't help it. No matter, every time you say it, it's a new joke.
It's a new joke. Yeah, so the planet Uranus apparently is on its side, which until I saw this article, I didn't realize that it was its rings. Yeah. It rotates. I don't know. It rotates on its side. What's going on with that?
It does. The Earth tilts, if you see a globe, right, it's tilted about 23 degrees, 22, 23 degrees. But if you were to have a Uranus globe, it would be tilted like 98 degrees.
Huh.
So basically on its side.
And is that because it got hit by something really hard and got knocked out?
Yeah, that's basically the theory is that way back when, early in its lifespan, early in its life, it got hit, by a sizable, chunk of rock, which is what we're talking about, and it was enough to knock it on its side.
Is that the theory on why the Earth is at a 23-degree tilt as well? Is it?
Yeah, I don't know. Probably, but I'm not certain that every planet would normally be zero. I think that most planets would be approximately zero, closer to zero.
Yeah,
but not precisely. Although Mercury is pretty close to zero. But Uranus is an oddball for that reason. That it is like that. And basically, it's a bunch of computer models they do to sort of see what the possibility is of it being made that way by collision, and the possibility is really high. Basically, is what the story's telling us.
Yeah. Well, I'm once again reminded that how these parallels between what happens out there in space and how we describe that and what's happening in our social lives are the same. I feel like our country got knocked on its Uranus on its side. You're right. That is the Trump administration.
Yeah, I feel like maybe we're back in the early days of the solar system with the constant bombardment.
That's great imagery. It's all heating up, and we're not doing so well with it all the time. Hey, that's astrophysicist Paul Wallace. He's going to hang on. Normally you get to call, but we're doing a pre-record today. But we'll be back here after the break on Minnesota's Progressive Repartee on AM 950. Hey, welcome back to AM 950's Repartee, our afternoon conversation about things progressive and things colliding. And today, talking with astrophysicist about what happened in the solar system and how now, Paul, I know that I brought this up with you, and you said you're a bit skeptical of this story, but there's this big news story going around on CNN that the oldest Earth rock was found on the moon. And again, this is like 1970s flashback day, apparently, because when I was a kid, moon rocks were the biggest dealio in the world. But I'm just going to do a recap of the storyline as I can understand it, of what some astrophysicists are suggesting happened. And that is that when the Earth and Moon were closer together, I don't know, 1 billion years ago or 4 billion years ago or whatever it was, which is also interesting to me that they were much closer, and what that gravitational pull must have been if the moon affects our tides the way it is. So, but anyway, they're closer together, that a meteor hit the Earth, which sent rock spilling out of the Earth, sort of the way water, if you throw a rock into water splashes up. A rock went shooting up and hit the moon and embedded in the moon. And then another meteor later hit that same place and created a crater. And then later, much billions of years later, astronauts land on the moon, happen to take a sample of rock from the moon, and come back with this very part of a rock that had melded then with parts of the moon's surface and substance. And they say that this rock that came back had originally started on the Earth, because they can tell by the way that it cooled, and then it, having been shot up to the moon, hit again and made available by another crater, and then stumbled upon by a couple of astronauts on the moon. That is a story that really just blew my mind, that the oldest rock was found on the moon and then brought back by the astronauts. Like, this is almost as complicated as how Donald Trump, destroyed our entire civilization.
Perfect storm, right? Perfect storm.
How in the world? Okay, so is that what happened? We need the definitive word on this. And do we just happen to get so lucky that the astronauts stumbled onto this piece of moon rock with Earth rock embedded in it?
Well, so there's a few steps here. The first step is Earth gets whammed by a big rock, okay, at 4 billion years ago, 4.1 billion years ago, and sends stuff out into space.
Yep.
That's completely believable. That's like not even a question that has happened. That is pretty much scientific, Yep, check that box. Next box is that rock has got to hit the moon.
Like a real moon shot.
Like, yeah, which is also not unlikely. I completely buy that, because the moon was closer, and any rocks that are going to go in that direction, and there were plenty of bombarding rocks flown up into space at the time, some rocks are going to end up on the moon.
Wow.
In fact, we find Mars rocks on Earth at the poles. Same sort of idea. So that's not surprising. That rock would get buried over time, because the moon was also molten at the time, and then eventually, another rock would hit it and send it out again. Also not believable. But the part that I can't believe is that the astronaut picked up that one of those rocks.
Right.
Those rocks certainly exist on the moon, no doubt, but they've got to be, 1 in a billion.
So 48 years ago from this story, when the astronauts are walking on the moon, they're taking organics. They want to take.
They just pick up samples. Yep.
Organic samples to figure out what it is, And as they've analyzed that rock, I don't know if this is now over more recently, why this story's out, or if they're just talking about what happened 48 years ago. But this David Kring, who's a principal investigator for the Center for Lunar Science and Exploration, like fantastic title, by the way. I mean, that guy. Yeah, he gets when someone says, "Hey, so David, what do you do for a living?" And he says, "I'm the principal investigator for the Center for Lunar Science and Exploration." He's he and you are the most interesting guys in the room for the rest of that conversation. But he said he challenged his team to go find a bit of Earth on the moon, and that they did it. That they found old Earth rocks on the moon, not just finding moon rocks on Earth, but Earth rocks on the moon.
And the oldest also, which is cool. I mean, the oldest exposed rocks on Earth are 3.5 billion, something like that, years old. So not only to find a rock, but to find the oldest one. That would be something.
So you're skeptical. You're skeptical.
I'm a little skeptical. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure how big the data set is of moon rocks that we've analyzed. I don't know how many thousands we've looked at.
Oh, I see.
And also, if you read the article, you'll read that a rock like this could have formed deeper in the moon, in what's called the mantle, like below the crust of the moon, and that a rock like this might be more common down in the mantle of the moon.
I see.
And I'm wondering if we just found a bit of an unusual moon rock and not necessarily an Earth rock.
Yeah, and that the moon has a similar. It's more molten rock has a similar set of conditions or similar.
Yes, and composition.
Composition, yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Well, it's really a fun story, though, to think, isn't it? I mean, it really. I mean, that's kind of fun too, and that, if that's the way it is, then that's fine. That the Earth and the Moon are more similar than each other, and they've developed, and they happen to find a piece of rock that made its way from the mantle of the moon up to the surface, and they grabbed that one. But it's way more fun to think, no, there was a rock on the Earth, it got hit by a meteor, it shot up to the moon, landed, got hit by a crater. That crater just happened to be on our side of the moon, pretty much where the astronauts landed, and when they took up a sample, boom, money shot. It allows someone to believe that you could possibly fall in love, right? This is where it takes me as a
right.
Because if you did the calculations on what does it take to actually find someone that you could love and would live with you, and you start running down the statistics on that, what it would take, you're like, there are 0 people, and what are the chances that he or she is like at my work? Not possible. And you just say, if the statistics, it's not possible statistic dominates everything, people don't leave their house. It drives you toward that sense of possibility. So it's one of those great stories, which I think is wonderful that CNN wants to tell those stories, because they kind of create that a fun narrative around what it does.
And it could be true. It could be true. But my belief bottlenecks right there, where the astronaut picks up one of those rocks. They have to be on the moon somewhere, but I just find it hard to believe that they would happen to pick up one of those.
Totally. If that astronaut is not buying a lottery ticket every day, he's really tempting fate, because he's the luckiest, literally luckiest human in the universe. If you pulled that one up,
that's right.
If they stumbled on that. Well, we do sort of hope, though, that when you're living in sort of what feels like a log jam and a sense of impossibility, that every once in a while something's going to pull you out of it, and that's sort of what these science stories remind us. There's a lot of people. I'm in that faith tradition. A lot of people who don't trust science think that it's all like cold-hearted and just mere facts, and there's no wonder, no possibility, because everything seems to be sort of mathematically determined. And what I love talking with you about is you just sort of reminded it's just the opposite of that.
Wonder drives the whole thing.
Yeah,
that's what drives the whole thing.
Wonder drives.
I know it can seem like it's lost on the other end when you start. When you sit in a science class, you can lose that wonder, but that is what's behind the whole thing.
Well, thank you, my wonder friend, Paul Wallace, astrophysicist.
You're welcome.
Thanks all for being a part of the repartee, and stick with us here over the weekend on AM 950, the Progressive Voice of Minnesota.